Hello and welcome back to the Genealogy Kickstart series. In this lesson, we'll begin looking at some of the different types of records that you'll likely be working with. There are many different types of records that can contain genealogical information. We'll only be looking at some of the most commonly used ones here in this lesson. However, keep in mind that there are likely many other types that could prove useful for your research. The most basic records that all genealogists look for are birth, marriage, and death records. These are often referred to as vital records. Census records can also be a great source of information about our ancestors and their families. We'll be looking in more detail on these two types later in this lesson. Religious records can also prove helpful, especially in an era before the government required the registration of a birth, marriage, or death. In these cases, the religious records may be the only ones that were ever recorded for these events. Government agencies have also kept a variety of records for different purposes, whether it be at the municipal level, the county, the state, or even the federal level. For example, tax assessment lists. It was usually in the best interest of the local government to make sure that they had accurate information about who was required to pay taxes and how much. I've found these lists can be very helpful in determining when an ancestor lived in a particular location and how their circumstances changed over time. Voters lists may also be available that can help establish when your ancestors lived in a given location. You may be able to find citizenship or naturalization records for your ancestors. And there were many different types of licenses that they may have had to apply for. Anything from dog licenses to business and professional licenses. Passenger records can be very helpful in finding information about your immigrant ancestors. However, whether these records existed or if they're still available often depends on the period in which the immigrant came and the ports that were used. There are a number of different types of directories that your ancestors may have appeared in, such as city directories that are often used for genealogical research. Your ancestors may have appeared in court records. For example, if your ancestor died leaving property or land, there often would have been a probate in which the estate would have been entered into the court system for settlement. Your ancestors may have been involved on one side or the other of a lawsuit, which left court records, or even a divorce. Although not as common as they are now, divorce did happen. So if you find an ancestor who remarried, don't always assume that the spouse died. Dig a little further into the circumstances of how that marriage ended, just in case. If you had colorful ancestors, like many of us do, you may even find them in criminal cases. Land records are very important to look for, and you should always research your ancestors to find out if they owned property. Military records may have been generated for your ancestors if they were of eligible age during a conflict such as a war. Even if they didn't serve, they may have been required to register for a draft. Many of our ancestors appeared in the local newspapers, in articles such as obituaries and wedding announcements, and even who won the prize at the county fair. Depending on the size of the town, there may also have been a society column, or as it's often called, the gossip column, which talked about all of the happenings of the residents in town, such as who was having dinner with whom, who had guests from out of town, or who was going away on vacation. I tend to think of the newspapers as the Facebook of their day. You may be able to find your ancestors listed in cemetery and funeral home records. Sometimes these records have even more information about your ancestors than you can find in their death certificate and obituary. So always try to see if you can find those too. You could also find information in a variety of home records, such as those that you might find in your own family history collection, which I discussed in an earlier lesson. Before we go into more detail on some of the record types that I just mentioned, I want to take a moment to talk about evaluating the records that you find. This is a large topic, so I'll only touch on it briefly here. But it's important that you keep some questions in mind as you look at each record. For example, how reliable is the information in the record? What was the source of that record and why was it created? Was it written down in an attempt to record as accurately as possible the basic facts? Or was it written for some other reason in which the accuracy was not as important? Was it made close to the time of the event, or was it written down many years later? Was the information provided by someone with firsthand knowledge, or was it something that was told to them, in which they received it second or possibly even third hand? All of these questions can greatly affect the accuracy of the information and how we can view that information. For example, these are two articles that appeared after the drowning death of my grandfather's brother when he was 8 years old. Because the newspapers were more interested in sensationalism and getting the paper out as quickly as possible, they didn't bother to do much fact checking. So both of these articles have numerous errors. When possible, look for multiple records to try and confirm the information that you find. Try to see if multiple records that all discuss the same piece of information agree or disagree. If that information conflicts, try to resolve that conflict. In large part, you do this by evaluating the records and trying to determine which ones are more likely to be accurate. Luckily, in the case of my grandfather's brother, I also have his death certificate available. Using that, I can look at those articles and try and determine which parts of them were accurate and which were not. Now let's take a look at vital records. Generally, these records will contain the date of the birth, marriage, or death, and usually the location of the event. It may provide the names of the parents, and if you're lucky, the maiden name of the mother. A death certificate may provide the name of a spouse, the place of burial, and maybe even the cause of death. An occupation may be listed on a death certificate, and sometimes even on a marriage record. You may be able to see the names of who the witnesses were at the marriage, or who the informant was for the death information. These can be very helpful because the witnesses and informants are usually family members, and their names could lead to additional records or may help evaluate the information that was provided. What information that you get in one of these vital records greatly depends on the source of the record, when it was created, and where the event took place. For example, these three images are all marriage records, but the information they contain was recorded in very different ways, and how much information varies from record to record. This is an example of a death certificate from 1931. On this record, you can see where and when he died. You can see what the cause of the death was, the location where he's buried, and the date that he was buried. It provides the name of the undertaker. All of these can be very helpful if you're trying to find cemetery or funeral home records, which may have more information than you can get here in the death certificate. It provides the information of where he lived prior to his death. It lists the name of his wife and his occupation. It also provides his birth date and where he was born. But always be careful with this type of information because it's only as accurate as the knowledge of the person who provided it. In this case, we can see that the informant was his wife. However, Nettie was actually his third wife, and she didn't meet him until he was close to 60. So she never knew about his earlier life or when his parents were alive. As you can see, she knew the name of his father, but she didn't know where he was born, or the name of his mother, or where she was born. So for any of the information that she provided, it's best that I do further research in order to determine how accurate that information is. Now let's take a look at census records. In the United States, a census has been taken every 10 years since 1790. However, the information that you can get varies greatly from record to record, depending on which questions were asked in that census year. In the earlier records, they only asked for the name of the head of the household, and everybody else was grouped by age ranges and genders. However, in 1850, they began asking for the names of each person within the household and the ages for each of these people. You may also be able to find information such as the relationships between each person within the household. You can determine where they lived and sometimes even their exact address. You can find who lived around them, their neighbors. This can often be important to determine who they associated with, who might have been a future spouse, or did other family members live nearby. Some census records give you occupation information and maybe even the name of the employer. A census record may help you to find out how prosperous the family was. This can be seen with questions such as, did they rent or did they own property? How much the property was worth, or even how much money they made in wages in the previous 12 months. You may be able to find their citizenship status if you had an immigrant ancestor. In some years, they asked when they immigrated or when they became naturalized. You may be able to determine where they were born or even where their parents were born. It's important to look in every census year that you can find during a person's lifetime. Because these questions change so much over time, you want to be able to gather as much information as possible. This is an example from the 1940 census. I was looking for information about the particular family highlighted here in yellow. However, this was not the only relative on this page. In fact, the households both before and after included family members. The one at the top was one of his brothers. The second household was his widowed mother and two of his unmarried siblings. Even the household below him is one of his married sisters and her family. It's always a good idea to look at everybody else who's on that page, and often on the page both before and after, in order to see if other family members or associates live nearby. Now let's look at how to find someone in the 1940 United States Census. 1940 is the most recent census year that has been released to the public. Although there are several different sites that you can go to search for census records for the United States, here we'll look in FamilySearch.org because it's free and easy to use. If this is the first time that you've used their site, you will need to first create an account in order to access their records. However, this is free and easy to do. They only ask a few questions and they don't try to sell you anything. Next, click on Search. Go ahead and click on Catalog. This is the fastest and easiest way to access the census records. This will take you to the Catalog search page. In the place box, start typing the United States. Once you do this, it will provide suggestions on the proper way to enter this search. In this case, click on United States and then click on the search box. The page that appears will be a long list of all of the different record types that are available for you to look at. Scroll down until you see Census 1940. Click on that and it will provide you with a link. This will pull up a page with information about the 1940 census records. Scroll a little bit down on the page until you see a link that says 1940 records are available here. Click on that link and it will bring up a search page that will allow you to look in the census records. Here I've entered a name and I've entered information to narrow it down to someone who was born in New York between the years of 1898 and 1900. I know that he was born in 1899, but sometimes the age given on a census record can be a little bit younger or a little bit older. So I'm entering a range so that I don't accidentally eliminate the correct record. I also have the option to add residence in 1940 if, for example, I didn't know where he was born, but I knew where he was living at the time of the census year. I also added the name of his spouse. This increases the odds that I'll get the correct Raymond when I do this search. If it's someone who's not married, you could also use someone else who might have been in the household, such as the name of the father or the mother. Because I've entered enough information for the search to recognize the person that I'm looking for, the very first person on the results page happens to be the correct one. When I click on his name, I get the information that has been indexed for him. These are the fields that have been transcribed from the census record and entered into an index that allowed me to search for the record. However, it's not all of the information that was asked for in the census record. So I want to be able to see everything that was available. It's always a good idea to see the original record if it's available. To do this, click on the thumbnail sketch for the image or click on the link below it that says View the Original Document. Once I do that, the actual image for the census page appears on the screen. Because it's trying to display the entire page, the print is too small to be able to read at this scale. Instead, I'll need to use the tools on the left in order to enlarge the image. Once I do this, I can see everybody who's listed in that household. And as I scroll across to the right, I can see every question that was asked and all of the answers for each person in the household. This leads us to our next exercise, finding your family in the 1940 census. Try and identify somebody who is listed on your pedigree chart who would have been alive in the United States in 1940. Someone that you know enough about such as where and when they might have been born, or at least where they might have been living in 1940, so that you can recognize them when you search and you have enough details about them in order to conduct the search. If your family wasn't here in 1940, maybe you can use the name of a family member or a friend or an in-law, or maybe just someone who was famous who was living during 1940. Go to familysearch.org, create the free account, then follow the steps that I showed you in this presentation in order to access the 1940 US Census records. Once you get to the search box, go ahead and enter the name, and if possible, the birth location and the birth year range, or the location of where that person was living. Look for the correct person in the results list. If there are too many and you can't identify the correct person, add some additional information, such as the name of a spouse or a parent, or someone else who might have been in the household in that same year. Click on the thumbnail image or the link below it to pull up the original image. Then look at the information in each field on the form for every person who's part of that household to discover more information about your family. Next time, we'll look at how to do a general search for many different types of records online. So please join me next time for lesson 4.